You have entered Roguelike Radio.
Hello and welcome to Roguelike Radio, the procedurally generated podcast where all of the participants eventually die. Joining me today to talk about simulationism, and very simulation-heavy roguelikes, we have...
I'm Tarn Adams. I'm a co-founder of Bay 12 Games and co-creator of Dwarf Fortress, a simulation-heavy colony management and roguelike game.
I'm Sami Maaranen, creator of Unreal World, a Finnish starvation simulator.
I'm Darren Gray, a maker of various small abstract games and completely unqualified beyond this episode.
And I'm Mark Johnson. I make Ultima Ratio Regum, which is a kind of culture and, well, mainly a culture simulation game. So there we are. Thank you all for joining me. And judging from the previous few seconds, this might be a slightly... comic episode, I sense, but we shall see how it all plays out. So, how would you each define the major simulation goals in your games? As I think that the kind of three major aspects that the three of us are trying to create in our respective gigantic mega sim games are quite different in a lot of ways. So what would you each say are the main kind of 2 or 3 core simulation goals that you're trying to pursue?
Well, in Dwarf Fortress, we're mainly going for a kind of a narrative generation, just sort of have what they say like emergent narratives. We want the simulation to just have enough pieces bouncing around so that if someone inhabits a role in the world, say a colony of dwarves or an adventurer, that the game will react to what they do and they'll kind of feel like they're part of the story, and that they can properly experience what it would be like to be whatever role it is that they're inhabiting. So that's the main function of simulation for us is kind of a narrative exercise.
And in Unreal World, we are basically creating a wilderness exploration or survival simulation roguelike, and evidently we are putting a lot of focus to wildlife and simulating animal behavior and food chain and that kind of stuff. Also nature generation and the weather and the seasons and how the world rolls. That's also important. And third, maybe it would be the nutrition, because one of the key elements in Unreal World is to eat. For some, it's the only element for those who haven't played it that much. So I guess those would be 3 if I had to pick 3.
I think for you, my largest goal, like I say, is probably simulating culture. And that very, very much goes back to my kind of academic background and research, in that I'm very intrigued by questions of how can we sort of program culture, how can we define culture, what aspects of culture are visible in how people act, or in how books are written, or in how paintings are painted, or in how people move around a city, or how they build their city. So my main kind of simulation goal really is to have a world where it never explicitly tells you what culture you're in, but just by observing how people dress and how they act and how they behave and how they live their lives and how they kind of reflect upon the world that they're living in, that should tell you a lot about each of the cultures that you run into. And inevitably there's always going to be a little bit of sort of simulation is always simplification and that type of issue. But I'm trying my best to make the cultures in the game sufficiently kind of detailed and dense that shouldn't be the case too much. And I also hope that, and this is beginning to emerge now, that you should always be able to look at completely different things in the game and sense that they're from the same culture. So you look at someone's clothes, you look at the layout of a city, and you talk to someone, and from those 3 things there should be some kind of tacit, implicit similarities there that show you that they're from the same culture.
I avoid simulation entirely, which makes it very interesting to me seeing from a more external design perspective. And one thing I've noticed actually is when you go too abstract, players really struggle to understand what on earth is going on. If you have a game which is entirely rules and there's no context for what you're doing, everything is letters just for the sake of differentiating elements instead of being A is for ant, players really struggle. So simulation, I found, can actually be a very useful tool just for getting the mechanics into people's heads. They understand that that enemy is a monster, and therefore that is the reason you have to attack it. And simple things like bumping into a monster will attack it, and there's a chance to miss, and that's based on the simulation of some sort of sword fight going on or something like that. So I have found through my experiences that simulation has a value even if you're not trying to make a simulationist game.
So when, therefore, will we be seeing the epic Darren Gray simulationist roguelike?
I guess in a very, very long time. Probably after Ultima Ratio Regum is released. How about that, Mark?
That's not too many years away. You need to get planning now, I think. Interesting. So what made both of you create very simulation-heavy games, and what types of things encourage you towards these kinds of very time and effort, and in my experience, bug fixing heavy types of roguelikes? And alongside that, I guess, what types of things keep you all motivated, really, over many years and over releases which can stretch to more than 1 year? In that it's the 12th now, so in 5 days it will be a year since I last put out a new version. And I believe Unreal World and Dwarf Fortress have both had versions which took more than 1 year to release.
Yeah, at some point. Yeah.
Yeah. I did 25 months, I think, is my current record.
Whoa.
And yeah, it was a mistake. You should really try and release every once in a while. You're just going to bury bugs so deep in there that you don't even have the ability to take them out anymore. But yeah, I mean, for me, like, simulation was part of the big draw, just because when you're writing, I mean, I started young and was just writing games, and basically my brother and I and a few friends, and you could, I guess, write stories to each other or something, but like a plot-heavy game just wouldn't make sense as something that you could replay, and like Darren was saying, having a abstract game, I don't know, it's for us, it just wasn't quite as compelling, I guess. So we use simulation kind of as a replayability aid, and so that we wouldn't just have to sit and write paragraph stories at each other. So you just write lots of little mechanisms that bounce off each other, and you have a game that the developer can actually play. That was the beginning of it. And then once you start down that road, it's just, it's fascinating, right? I mean, you can pick anything and you can write a game about it, right? So anything at all. And it kind of feeds into sort of natural curiosity. You want to dig into something, break it down, and put it in the game. I've never had a motivation problem. I mean, I don't know if that was because I started as a kid or whatever. I mean, I just can't. I don't understand motivation issues that people talk about sometimes, because it's like you can just do something else, right? I mean, if I get I guess I get bored with things sometimes. Like if I get bored with doing minerals or something like that, I can just go on and do like next I'm doing magic system generation, right? That should be exciting for a while. You have such a deep well to dive into on any given topic, and you have so many different topics that it's kind of hard to imagine.
So were there any particular outside inspirations that push you towards specific directions in what you wanted to simulate in Dwarf Fortress, or did it just largely emerge from your own thoughts and plans and the comments of the players and these sorts of things?
We always wanted to make a fantasy game, so there was for us, people say we have the most banal possible influences, so that would be down at the Conan and Beastmaster and Ray Harryhausen level of influences, driving us forward at first, right? Just these cheesy fantasy things like, hey, well, it's, I'd like to just jump into a story there. I don't know how it's going to end, right? That's kind of the whole idea. And after, but that gets you to a certain point, and then suddenly you have, some thousand people that have their own idea of what they want the game to be, and everyone has different things that they're interested in. And you sort of have to think, I have this sort of large development plan of the kind of things that I think need to be in the game for it to sort of reach its full potential story-wise. And then you have to sort of get out to those things while keeping the game playable and not picking something so esoteric and strange that it doesn't really advance that agenda. So it's not so much that the players can influence that choice too much, because there are important things that need to be done. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the features that we choose to put in, the core features, it's mainly to service the formation of the skeleton and then the fleshing out of the skeleton. I mean, there's a lot of things the players influence in terms of like UI decisions and so forth, since we're so poor in that department ourselves, and other small things that help them out. We always listen. Yeah, mainly to service the overall narratives that we're going to do. For instance, we want to get the economic stuff in, and so we have this sort of decision about, do we do like land caravans or boats first, right? It's hard because you're going to have to rewrite your economy if you don't do boats first, because it's such a huge influence, and boats have so many different narrative hooks and so forth that you pick boats, right? And that's kind of where we're headed. And that's how all the decisions are made.
What about you, Sami? What made you intrigued by simulation in games?
When I first started back in the Iron Age, I don't think that I intended to create a simulation heavy game, but it just comes in quite naturally because more and more features and mechanics and stuff you want into game, and the bigger the vision about the game and the game world grows, the more simulation you are likely to need. And I like to think that there are many different kind of sectors of simulation going on, for example, in Unreal World, and I believe in all of our games. And they all contribute to the big picture. There's weather, and there is plants and nature and animals and nutrition and combat. So when you keep creating something bigger than a life project, you just end up having to create bigger or smaller blocks of simulation here and there. And like Tarn said, you just easily get carried away with it. It's real fun, and it goes into that direction quite naturally, I think.
Have you ever run into any of the motivational issues that Tarn has not?
I guess not, because I've also been doing this for so long that it has become like a lifestyle. And I don't know, some people like crossword puzzles. I like programming, so it's basically that simple. But of course, periods of activity with the development have been changing, and sometimes you have more energy to concentrate on coding and sometimes you don't. But not real lack of motivation, never. And if something like that should happen, then there are the players and the feedback and the community, and you are quite soon back on track.
Were there any particular outside inspirations for Unreal World, or did it very much spring forth from your imagination?
There are. At first, it's the usual story for me too. I wanted to create a roguelike of my own after playing good old roguelikes. But then I also used to play lots of pen and paper role-playing games back in the day and enjoyed them quite a bit. And I played Dungeons and Dragons and RuneQuest and later Handmaster and stuff like that. But then there was this crazy Finnish pen and paper role-playing game called ANC. It was abbreviation, and it was stand for Adventurers of the North, Kalevala Heroes. And this particular game was a little bit of eye-opener for me, because I then realized that everything doesn't have to be like sword and magic and dragons and dungeons, that even our little country can have a inspiring and interesting cultural history, and we can create quite a good fantasy or semi-fantasy or low fantasy or whatever game out of our own roots, like roots of my own people and country. So that was eye-opener. It was an underground game, and it was like a slap in the face that, okay, maybe you should also skip the swords and dragons and potions and pick up something else. That was a big influence for sure.
So that's based on the old Kalevala tales.
Yeah, exactly.
Finnish myths.
Exactly.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah. It was really interesting as a pen and paper game, because it was quite marginal even in Finland, because everybody had Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that.
Of course, Dungeons and Dragons is very heavily based on Tolkien, who himself was inspired by Kalevala.
Yeah, the circle closes, kind of.
For me, it was largely the same thing at first, in that I just wanted to make a roguelike, as it seemed like a cool genre of game to make. And then after about a year or so, I hadn't really created anything remotely new or intriguing, and then one day I thought, culture, let's see if anyone's really done this. And at least according to my understanding of what it would be like to simulate culture, speaking as someone who does sociology as his job, I thought, actually, no one's really done culture in the way that I would think, with the kind of depth that, or rather with the kind of spatial aspects and the visual aspects and the interpersonal aspects, which I think add up to what we would call culture in the real world. So I thought, okay, let's give this a shot. And then as time went on, I also found that I was increasingly reading novels which tended to kind of, I think the genre is called historical metafiction these days, or meta-historical romance, that's the one. Things like Neil Stevenson and Wu Ming and people like that, and these types of novels which were historical novels, but were very much about kind of what's the intellectual environment of a particular era, what's the culture of a specific era, and how do these things influence how people live and how people think about their world and these sorts of things. This then sort of segued into what I was already programming, and then that then led to an idea for a plot, and then from that point onwards it just sort of seemed to all fall into place, really. And I also haven't really run into the kinds of motivation issues either, but again I think it's largely what Tarn said, in that if I get bored of doing techie stuff, then I can just do some art stuff next day. Or if I get bored of doing art, I can do AI. If I get bored of doing AI, then I can do some bug fixing. If I get bored of bug fixing, I can do some other thing. And since it's just a one-man project, there's always something that I wake up and think, I'd really like to code that this morning, and then I just go and do that.
I suppose it's one of the advantages of having so big a project that there's always so many different things to be working away at.
It is, definitely. And I've had a bunch of people over the time, and I'm sure that you both have as well, offer to do art or to help me with a certain piece of code and stuff, and that's really nice, clearly, but I always say thank you so much but no thank you, because I just rather do it all myself, really, partly for the always having something intriguing and new to do reason, and partly just because it would seem deeply strange to add in a second or third person to the project now, and also because I don't fancy going back through my 500,000 line file and commentating it.
Just one question based on that is, I think all three of you have had fairly long periods where you haven't released in a while, and I'm wondering if that has something to do with this kind of, if you're bored of one thing, you move on to another, so you never quite polish it to a release-worthy state, or is it other things? Because you all say that you've got the motivation, you keep doing it, this is a lifestyle thing now. But, there definitely have been big periods of non-release.
Well, for me, I did know exactly what I wanted in this release before I started, and I just haven't finished it yet. This release has in fact got smaller since I released the previous release, because I realised that my initial intention for this release was just too big, but the plan for this version was always twofold. It was just fill the world up with millions of PCG people going about their days, and 2, let you speak with them, and that's it. And that's just taken longer than I thought, just because it was a far kind of grander challenge. And I have tried to really focus myself on this release and not to do other cool things, and for the most part I've stuck to that. But in my case at least, and I hope to never ever ever do another release this long, in my case it's just I underestimated how big a task AI would be, well, AI / pathfinding / scheduling in such a big and complex world. I just didn't think it would be as complex as it was, basically.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much the story of every nightmare release that I've had. You don't quite see it. You don't quite see how hard it's going to be sometimes, and occasionally, because you've been working on it for so long, you do take a lark off here. And then sometimes you don't see how long that's going to take. So they kind of those kind of things can go together. And you end up, suddenly it's a year, right? And you just don't know quite why it happened. You can think about it, and then you're like, well, yes, that's exactly why it happened, because I did it again. So I mean, you can fight this, but I don't think the incentives are there for projects like ours quite the same way they are with people that have deadlines and employees and a window of sale and all that kind of thing to get it right or to change our ways necessarily, right? I mean, I've been struggling and trying to do a good job keeping releases down to some months now, and I've been doing okay, just because people get so frustrated and because bugs get so bad when you let it go a long time. But it's something that you have to be consciously working at doing all the time, or you'll fail.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it goes. It's usually that you start something so big that you don't know how long it takes to finish it, and you just can't go for a release in the middle of some huge improvements because you have broken the code down so that the playable state of the game has been lost to some extent, and you just have to finish what you have started before releasing. So taking too big bites is often the reason for a delayed release. And also I avoid saying deadlines out loud nowadays to quite extent, even though the players, of course, they are keen to know when you'll be releasing this and that. But I've noticed that deadlines can't ever be kept, or very rarely. So it's better to say that this year or next year, and that's it. Leave it that.
To be honest, I think I might start doing that from this point onwards. In that, I think I am being accurate and truthful in saying I have about 3 months left on this on 0.8, and then it's done. But from that point onwards, partly for all the reasons we've said, and partly at least for me, in that seeing as this is basically a hobbyist project, and now that I'm fully employed as a postdoc, I just don't have all that much. I have less time than I had in the past, and I think I might be a little bit guilty of having made my time estimates on the basis of Mark doing a PhD rather than Mark fully employed. And the latter definitely has less time. Well, not just less time, but also less freedom over when peaks and troughs of work take place. Whereas in my PhD, I broadly had a lot of control over that. Whereas now, I can think I have a week free, and then suddenly some huge funding call comes up which I can't not send a thing off to, and so then suddenly I spend 3 days writing that thing, and then suddenly the week I thought I had to code in the evenings, I no longer have. So I think it's both aspects for me, at least.
My key takeaway there, Mark, is you just said in 3 months you'll have a release deadline.
My deadline is the 1st of August, which that's 3.5 months. But that's my absolute deadline, and if I don't make that, then I'm not going to commit to anything on the record, but I will be disappointed with myself, and I will take a good long hard look at myself in the mirror with a look of disgust upon my face. That's what will happen. So we talked a lot about how simulation games intrigue us from a purely kind of design-based orientation, but what do you all think is so intriguing and so compelling about simulation games for players?
My players have had, like, I wouldn't call them arguments. They've had discussions on the forum about kind of what category they put themselves in, whether they are a kind of a person that enjoys storytelling or role-playing, or whether they're sort of a tinkerer, someone who wants to figure out how the rules work, whether they're someone who just likes to passively observe a cool simulation happening. I think those all come into play depending on the person. Like when I play a simulation game like Sim Earth or something like that when I was a kid, I didn't care like to figure out the rules particularly. Like it didn't matter to me how the continental drift worked or something like that. I wouldn't try and like figure out numerically what was going on, but it was fun to watch the continents drift around and so forth, and have little animal species develop and so forth. So I mean, I just kind of personally experienced it as just sort of this experience or story, but other people will just go right into the details of the simulation, just want to figure out how it works. And I think simulations can be fascinating for a variety of reasons.
What about you, Sami?
This is a tricky question, and we should ask the players, really. People who are listening to this, please be sure to comment. We are a little bit biased to give an opinion here, but I think, of course, good simulation adds lots of replayability to any game. I think, but I also think that maybe there is something in the human nature that makes people or players curious about simulation games, really, that people like to observe things, and if there is a finally crafted simulation game, that same kind of human nature curiosity is ignited, and it's fun to observe or explore or try pushing the limits of the simulation to kind of to see how far the simulation goes. But it's really tricky question. I haven't pondered it too much, and these are just some ramblings and hunches from top of my head. So I don't know.
I think that those are both great points. For me, there's probably a third aspect, which is I think to me, simulation games are the best at kind of fully placing the player within this world and making you feel truly embodied within this fictional space. And that's always been something which has been really crucial to me in any fiction, whether it's books or novel or TV or film or games and so forth. It's really crucial to me to feel that the fictional world portrayed on screen or in the text would truly function. So in that regard, to me, something like the Sprawl world of William Gibson, I think that world is kind of hugely internally consistent, even if you ignore the megabytes issue. But aside from that, I think the world makes total sense and could exist, and even if you took the camera away, so to speak, it would still function. Whereas something like the Star Wars world, and I'm sure that a lot of people will jump down my throat for all this, the fictional world of Star Wars makes no goddamn sense on any conceivable level. And if that universe existed, every aspect of its society and its economy and its political systems would just implode within a second as soon as you turned the camera off. And then other things are somewhere in the spectrum between those. So for me, simulation games are largely about really showing the player this place that you are in has not just been put there because you're playing a computer game and you're walking through a level within a game, but it kind of helps the suspension of disbelief on some level that if you look outside a building, you don't just see a skybox, which is clearly a skybox, but you can go outside and look around and go up the hill and go up the cliff and do whatever. And I think, to me, that's a pretty huge part of the appeal of the simulation, of making it seem much more like a true world that you are exploring, rather than a game world which has been kind of arbitrarily put there just for the player's amusement.
I think tying in with that is when you're kind of seated inside a game and you're controlling a character who is your avatar within that game, and you're surrounded by these simulated mechanics. You feel very immersed in there, and then when you're overcoming obstacles within that environment, it just feels it's that much more intense when it's sort of simulationist and believable. And in particular, when you face a particular challenge, when you come across some sort of obstacle or something goes wrong, and you have to think about how you're going to get through that, and you manage to think through it in a very innovative way based on the simulation, you feel so much more clever for that. That you've taken into account the whole everything that's going on. Like in FTL, say, when the game never tells you, at least I'm not sure if it tells you, that if there's a fire going on, you can just vent the oxygen out to get rid of the flames. But the first time you do that and you think through the situation, oh damn, that bit's on fire, what am I going to do? Well, I'll just open up the doors and all the air sucks out and the flames go away. You feel really clever for that because you're taking advantage of the kind of the simulationist rules within the game. And similarly, of course, when you accidentally vent out your own troops and kill them because of that, you feel slightly less clever.
Speak for yourself.
So simulation is a great way of getting the player really into the scenario and engage much more with the mechanics that are going on because they believe in the mechanics going on. And they're looking more for ways to be clever and ways to engage with the content on a much deeper level than just, hitting the X button to attack. Also, of course, tying in a bit with what you're saying about these universes that the games can take you into, a simulationist experience that is in an experience that we can't have in our normal daily life, such as running a fortress of dwarves or getting into, being a bear hunter in Iron Age Finland. These are experiences we're not really going to have in our lives. Well, very rarely anyway. And simulationist games give us this chance to really have these experiences that are beyond what we can normally achieve. One of my great loves when I was a kid was playing Frontier, which is a space simulationist game. These days there's a new version of it called Elite Dangerous. And one of the things in the old games, it had full Newtonian simulation of the planets in the galaxy. And you could speed up time and watch planets spin around the sun. And it was just fantastic to go and see this. This is something we're not going to see in our lifetimes, but you go and see what these other stars would look like. And in the new game, it does a model of the entire Milky Way, such that if you go to a different part of the Milky Way, you can see what the night sky would look like exactly from that position, you know, what the accretion disk would look like, what the constellations would look like, and so on. And that's just wonderful. It's a really wonderful feeling to be able to explore these literally out of this world experiences that we would not normally get to encounter.
I think that those are really great points, particularly what you said about kind of deepening the player's engagement with the game's systems. And I think a great example of something like that is the kind of meta game in EVE Online, which I used to play, but I don't these days. In that the simulation aspects are complex enough and deep enough that people find all these incredibly these kind of singularities within the game where 20 different game systems align with in a certain way to somehow give you a very niche advantage within a very niche scenario. And because the game is so fleshed out and does have all this info and all these details and all this richness to it, you know that if you search for those types of tactic, I guess, you will find them because the game is rich enough and simulated enough for them to be there. Whereas in less simulation games, I think it's far harder for players to discover strategies which are not so severe that they are a glitch, but which are not so mild that they are intended. I think the gap within there, kind of extremely strong, unexpected tactics, I think are far easier to emerge in complex simmy games rather than less simulation-y ones.
Yeah, I'm sure, Tarn, you must have some tales of things players have discovered you can do that you're like, wow, you can do that, and you've left it in, thinking that's nice.
Yeah, I'm always terrible at drawing examples out of my head that I haven't already drawn out of my head previously, but it's because it just makes me think of people with their vampires and their wells again. Horrible people. So if you bleed a vampire into your well, just because of that blood drinking, I mean, people drink a vampire's blood to become like linked to the vampire or whatever in some models of it. So that's just what we threw in. We're like, you drink a vampire's blood, you become a vampire. Okay, that's how it works. So people weaponize that. They're not good people, but they're fine. They're Dwarf Fortress players. And so they bleed a vampire into their well and like create this whole outer fortress that has a different class of citizens. They stick out there and eventually they all drink from the well and become this kind of elite vampire soldiers that live outside and don't need to eat or drink. I mean, they don't get blood. I'm sure some people feed them. I'm sure some people send citizens in there to feed them. That's probably how they deal with their migrant waves, right? It's just that you become food for the outer fortress. But it was stuff like that where it's like taking advantage of the different parts of the simulation to create a whole way to defend your fortress that works.
Yeah.
It's scary and it's strange, but it works. And I mean, it's unfortunate that the game doesn't realize, or it realizes partially like the weirdness of that situation. It's like the dwarves that are still regular dwarves that live in the internal fortress that's guarded by the vampires don't quite understand what's going on. I mean, they understand partially because they'll understand if one of their buddies gets eaten by a vampire or something. But they don't understand the overall strangeness of the situation, because that's kind of the hardest thing to do with a video game in general, is to sort of figure out just what's going on. and how do we put a simple name to this situation and a simple sort of concept that can be passed around between people that can kind of understand it if it's not something that you anticipated. That's sort of the hardest problem to solve, or one of the hardest problems to solve in simulation games. But yeah, so there we go. It's an example I've mentioned before, but I'm sure something else would come to mind if I weren't flu-addled.
There is one other thing I think players really appreciate in simulation games, and it ties in a little bit with the vampire blood story. It's when simulation does something funny, something really weird, that maybe is perhaps wrong, or maybe is just weird, slightly on the edge of reason, and so therefore kind of weird. And I think YouTube ends up full of these kind of here's something weird that happened in my vague simulation game. So strange things that happen in city skylines, or people playing The Sims and doing weird stuff, deliberately drowning their citizens and so on. And you get this with Dwarf Fortress 2. Boat Murdered is a very famous tale. And, the fun thing in that is when they try to use lava as a weapon, and it ends up killing a bunch of visiting nobles and starts off all sorts of panic. And these sorts of ridiculous situations coming out of the simulation, people love to talk about it because the simulation often is somewhat mundane. There's a lot of mundanity to it. There's lots of these little details you take care of, and it can be very fun sort of tiding around those details and watching them play out. But then when something really weird happens out of that, some little spike of chaos, that grabs people's attention. And I think people really love that in simulation games, the ability for it to come out with something really surprising and quite funny.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that it's like Dwarf Fortress seems like such a zany game, right? But we've played it completely straight. I mean, we're trying to be serious, and it's just, I mean, but it ends up like Monty Python or something, right? It's just, it's so, it's funny because it's not what we intended, but we still. It's funny enough that we enjoy it when it happens.
I don't think it would work if it was trying to be funny.
I
think
agree.
The fact that it plays it straight faced means that when it does go weird, it's all the funnier.
Definitely. In terms of programming and this links in quite well with what we've just been saying about kind of allowing unusual, strange, emergent things. Do you think that there are any kind of specific special requirements for coding a very simulation heavy game versus a non-sim heavy game? And if so, what do you think they are, and how tricky are they to navigate?
Well, let's have Sami go. Sami's the professional here. 27 billion years of experience. Let's hear it.
You make me sound so old. Okay, well, I think it takes quite a bit of planning to create a simulation-heavy game. You need to figure out lots of stuff and break things you want to simulate in the rules, more simple or less simple rules. Sometimes it comes down to mere physics. For example, if you're simulating up a trajectory of a projectile or something like that. But when you want to go simulating how the creatures in your world need to behave, how you want them to behave, then it's something that you basically need to make up by yourself or use your own creativity for that. There are no guidebooks for that. So I think planning is essential. Sometimes, of course, you jump right into business and start simulating something, but you have to correct your mistakes later on. So I'm in for careful planning. That's one thing. And of course, when there are lots of complex sectors of simulation going on in your game, which all contribute to the big picture, and they are talking to each other and interfering, it can end up in quite a mess. And when it works good, then it's good. But in times, for example, play testing or getting a good picture about your latest creations, how they affect the whole game world, it can be a bit of a pain because you have to spend quite a bit of time to get a grip how the world as a whole works. Those are two things that come to my mind of the subject.
Yeah, I mean it's hard. you have to. There's so much. Like if you're doing a large project like we are here, you have to think so much about future proofing once you go into it for a while, right? You're thinking about, how can I make, say, if you're adding weapons to the game or minerals or anything else, how can I create this object now so that I can do it in less than 25 months, but
ideally.
but so that I can use it 25 months from now and not have to change it too much. But you have to change it, right? It's not going to remain static, and so you have to become experienced with knowing how you're going to work and how your program works and what techniques people have developed in general for that kind of extensibility, or however you want to say it. And you get stuck right in the beginning with all this sort of rubber meets the road stuff about optimization and how granular should your simulation be right now to achieve what you want to achieve, but not overshoot. You don't want to do 50 variables that live underneath that the player never sees, that make the simulation have a slightly higher fidelity, but are much more likely to just crash and burn and waste your time implementing them. You develop a feel over time for what the right level of kind of resolution is for a model, and it's a challenge.
I think future proofing is a great point, and I mean, clearly I do speak as the person with the youngest project here, 5 years youngest. Anyway, clearly I do speak as that person, but I've definitely begun to find that in the last year or two, in that, particularly since this is the first thing I've ever coded, and I learned to code whilst making the game and all this stuff. Some of the really early code is not up to my normal meticulous standards of code quality, and some of the aspects of the game are stored in just these deeply bizarre ways that I'm scared to kind of open the lid on and look at properly. But that really showed me that, and I guess I realised this about a year and a half ago, I think, that future-proofing was something I needed to do, particularly in terms of developing this idea that multiple things from one culture should be comparable. I need to have some kind of system which is half-built now, some kind of system whereby the game can take any input and make any output from that, as in it can take a war as the input and produce a statue as the output, or it can take a religious schism as the input and then produce a novel as the output, and these types of things. So I realised that I needed a kind of omni-generalised system for putting in data and then having the game produce some kind of cultural item based on that data, which intellectually I guess I had realised when I began the game, but I hadn't on a technical level fully comprehended at that point what such a thing would look like and how extremely difficult it would be to make. So that would have been nice to have worked out at the start. But what you said, Tarn, about kind of what granularity should we be making this aspect at? One thing that I wonder, and I think that this speaks extremely well to all three of the games here, is what do you both think is the right balance for complexity? In that, is more always better, or is there a point where other factors such as player learning or player experience or how much time you have and so forth come into play?
Well, I mean, if in a perfect world where you're doing a simulation game, I mean, sure, more is better. It's like, if the player doesn't see it, then it's kind of pointless. But it's fine. But we have development time and computer resources and all that sort of thing to worry about. So you have to make pragmatic decisions. And I mean, for us, we think it's good to, if you can do the exposition to the player so they understand what's going on, and maybe one level beneath that. That's kind of where we aim to put it. I mean, you want to have some stuff bouncing around underneath to keep things exciting and to give you some room to move. And it's kind of like oil lubricating the parts. But you want people to understand vaguely what's going on. And we've failed on so many levels to live up to this fairly new standard for ourselves. But like, for instance, with personality-based decisions, right? We've got 50-something personality facets, 30 kind of intellectual values or whatever, needs, and likes and dislikes and personal histories and all of this stuff, and then someone decides to go to a party or not, and you don't know why, and it doesn't say anywhere. So it's that's essentially useless simulation going on there, because you're not going to follow a dwarf closely enough to understand that this is the person they are, and we give a big text dump that just says this is the kind of dwarf they are or whatever, and so you could kind of piece it together. But that's if you make a science project out of studying one dwarf in your fortress, then you kind of see that yes, we did program in a lot of stuff. But it would be preferable to have them just say, and we do this more and more now, just say like, this is why I did this, this is why I did this, and you can read their little thoughts and so forth. But it would be preferable not to have to go down and read those things and to search for them, but to just have it come up often enough that you feel like you're inhabiting a place where the rules are being followed. But so there's a potential for wasted complexity, and complexity is dangerous. You'll break your game. That's about it. I don't know.
Yeah, this is kind of an eternal question, and I don't know if anybody creates complexity just for the sake of creating complexity. It just comes along if you want to add this or that features. It's natural, but okay, there can be a question if we really need this or that feature. But as a developer, I think it's sometimes strangely satisfying to make things work in complex and detailed way, even though the same immersion or the gameplay experience could have been delivered to the player with less complex mechanics. There's something very, very fascinating about doing things in complex way. For example, in Unreal World, there are some mushrooms that have a symbiosis with certain kind of trees, and they only exist by those trees. And basically the same effect could have been delivered to the player just by randomly putting the mushrooms on a terrain. Nobody would ever notice it in 5 years that, okay, these mushrooms grow beside the birch trees. But it's nice to know that the possibility is there. And for somebody who discovers it, then it's a real great Easter egg. So complexity can improve your experience. But I don't know if more is always the better. The more is more, and some like complexity. I don't know, complex games by complex developers or something like that.
The secret of the mushroom is now out, of course. As soon as this episode goes live, everyone will know to check out the birch trees. I think for me, I definitely think that that issue you said around complexity being something that has some kind of meaningful effect on the player's experience, and if you could achieve the same effect as just doing this in a one-line piece of code that says choose 0 or 1, and if 1, do this. I think that's a really good point, of course, and I largely try to adhere to that. But I think to me another big metric of whether a bit of complexity should go in or not is, does this complexity have some meaning? And in that, if I can say, if I can have a religious festival be every week or every month or every year, say, then making all those work would be extra effort in terms of the kind of schedules required to make those happen. But I put that in because in many cases I have that relate back to the creation myths of that religion, and thereby kind of on both routes, from the religion to the festival and from the festival back to the religion, there's a kind of clear path of meaning there that the player can spot. Whereas if I just had it just pick whether it's each week or each month or each year, and that's just completely at random for every religion, I mean, yes, it would add some nice detail, and yes, it would add some variation, but it wouldn't make people sort of really get to know what are the religions and the cultures and the beliefs and so forth in this world. So for me, at least, I guess that's the kind of third metric of does this complex thing I'm coding relate to other complex things, or is it just kind of a single point on the graph which kind of only references itself, really? And if it's the latter, I'll sometimes put it in, but most often I will either try to find a way to link it with some other part of the game, or just not bother really.
It's good that the complexity has some meaning behind it. Of course, that's good. I've sometimes even degraded complexity of some of the current game mechanics if the complexity hasn't contributed that much to the gameplay experience. For example, back in the day, obtaining information about animal tracks was a bit more complex in the game. For example, you could examine certain kind of tracks and you were given information that these tracks are left by a relatively small creature which has paws and it has claws, and there are also marks of the tail been tracking on the snow, and the message was really something like that. And after player discovered those kinds of tracks a couple of times, they realized that they are fox tracks, and it was fun at some point to give this kind of verbose, vague information. But currently, if you examine that kind of tracks, the game just tells you that those are fox tracks, of course, along with the information about the age and the direction. But just one example that sometimes, at least I have gone to direction of degrading complexity at some parts of the game. And I would be interested to hear if you, Tarn, have gone to this dark side ever.
I was trying to think. I mean, I suppose people would argue that happened when I went to, oddly, when I went to the 3D, by which I mean a Z third coordinate. You could look at vertical slice or horizontal, whatever you want to call them, slices of your fortress up and down, because you lost the underground river with the flood patterns, and there were other kind of interesting mechanics that were associated with the chasm that always kind of ran through the center of the fortress. I mean, the underground became much more simulationist and complicated in appearance, but less complicated gameplay wise, I guess, in some ways. That was a large change that we kind of took a step back in a number of ways, but it was for the sake of future potential, I guess, that has not yet been realized in any way. So it's that happens quite a bit, I think, that we kind of take a step back and try and set the game pointed toward where we actually want to go, and then we get sidetracked or don't quite get to there, and it ends up being a degradation. But I'm sure there's more specific examples that are perhaps along those lines, because I've had similar thoughts along where you're coming from, where you try and give someone the experience of what it would be like to see something for the first time, but it ends up just becoming a longhand way of saying something that every player learns anyway. Quickly. So you just want to get to the point at some point. So yeah, it's I'm sure there's stuff like that as well.
Okay.
One thing that I think you see a lot in simulations, in terms of going too far, is that there's what I think of as the toilet line. As in, nobody simulates toilets. I don't think any of you simulate toilets, do you?
Nope.
No, but it has been requested many times.
I'm sure it has.
Yes.
And I've seen the same for Dwarf Fortress. Where do the dwarves shit? And the fact is that, in games, there's not a lot of fun things you can do with simulated toilets. In roguelikes, there's not a lot of fun you can have with needing to make the player empty their bladder now and then. In procedurally generated towns and buildings and all these, no one ever includes the toilets unless they're architects, in which case they are legally required to. And there's these sorts of things that we never really include, and it even goes outside of games. When you read someone's writing, even if someone's a very detailed writer, they never say when the characters go to the loo. Unless they happen to get killed in the loo. There's elements of life and culture and everything else that we do that just aren't interesting enough, or that we automatically kind of filter out of our own lives and that we don't really want to see simulated.
This is very true. I mean, in my case, I made a kind of deliberate choice a year or two back to have no food, even let alone bathrooms and things. in that I just didn't see much sort of simulation benefit for what I'm after by including food, for instance. But the kind of toiletish you always makes me think of when you watch films and TV shows where no one ever says, hang on a second, or they never start saying a line and then they stop and then they go back and so forth. And all those sort of micro conversational things just never happen because everyone just speaks perfectly and they always say exactly what they mean every time and they always say the perfectly crafted sentence. And maybe on one level, yes, we don't really want to see a program with people speaking how people speak in real life. Obviously, we all speak like that in real life. But then I don't think things like I can't think what there's a cinematic movement which tried to do exactly that, and I can't think what it's called right now. I will find it and paste it into the episode log. But the fact that there are a few cinematic movements, and for that matter, a few authors I can think of who do always try to have their characters speak in just a very natural voice, where they sometimes pause, they sometimes go back, they sometimes change what they're saying, and so forth. I think that does show maybe not necessarily an interest in simulating, in air quotes, these sorts of aspects of social life, but they at least show a kind of tacit awareness that, like you say, Darren, we only focus on the things that are of particular interest to the story or the world or the sensations that we want to get over to the reader or the viewer or the player.
Yeah, and I bet even in those plays where they have all the ums and ahs and broken speech, they still don't show the characters brushing their teeth and going to the loo.
Oh god, that's true. It's all a lie. You're so right. So seeing as here we have a survivalist sim, a story sim, and a culture sim, are there any kind of big major aspects of things that could be simulated in roguelikes specifically or in games more broadly, which none of the three of us intend to do, but we would like to see somewhere in the future?
I would be interested in seeing combat-wise what could be done beyond what I've already seen in terms of simulationist combat, because I think most simulationist combat ends up with this kind of meat and flesh simulation as opposed to fluid movements and interesting tense combat. I mean, Dwarf Fortress is the more what I'm thinking slightly on the meat and flesh side, and Ivan as well. It's games where you can, someone chops off your arm, so you pick off your arm and you hit them over the head with it, which is all lovely. But I'd also like to see the sort of combat where, if you get hit, you're probably dead. So the simulation is actually much more around the dance of combat or something like that. And given roguelikes are very, very combat heavy, it would be interesting to see a lot more of that on a simulationist side.
Well, I mean, to be fair, we did try and get a lot of movement into Dwarf Fortress combat. It's not, you don't really exchange blows standing in the same square most of the time. And that was important for us to do. There's a lot of movement between tiles, and the timing of attacks is also something that was important. There's a lead-in number of frames and a recovery number of frames and so forth. What I'm interested in seeing combat-wise, I don't know how. I mean, there's so many 7-day roguelikes now that I'm sure it's already been done many times, but just like reach. Have there been a lot of exploration of reach in roguelikes, like a dagger versus a spear kind of thing?
So the most there's been is ones like Rogue, where a spear has the special ability of maybe stabbing something an extra square away.
Yeah.
That's about as far as it goes.
Because we have, like with everything, we have vague plans, right? But there's so much you could do with just preventing attacks, like someone coming in to try and stab you with a dagger, you can simply prevent their attack, right? If you have a spear, and it's unexplored. And wrestling is also It would be interesting to see how to do that, because the Dwarf Fortress prescription for wrestling is like a game of Twister, right? It's terrible. But at the same time, it's hard to think of a terminology that wouldn't just be like borrowing from mixed martial arts fighting or something, which would make it sound really silly. There's all of the body positions are so important, right? Relative overall body position, and all of the names that people use for that nowadays are so modern. It would be difficult to kind of get it across without using graphics. Of course, graphics are I mean,
The G
they
word.
they solve so many problems, right? If you actually just showed a picture of the two.
But they
people.
create so much more effort, and in particular in simulationist games, graphics add so much more effort. The one game I've seen, the one roguelike I've seen that tries to do this wrestling style combat in Tales of Magial, there's a class called the Brawler, which has a number of grappling and pinning moves. But it mostly works on kind of exchanging status effects and kind of you use this move and then you use this move, and it's not really simulationist. It's more just using the mechanics in a kind of interesting way.
I also got thinking about combat now that it was brought up, and I think it would be really interesting to see some of the psychological aspects to combat, like it not being straightforward, but the combatants like yelling threats or exchanging glances, or I don't know what could be a way to do it, but to bring some kind of spaghetti western kind of intensity to combat. Because I would imagine that if two equally good swordsmen would have met sometime in some ancient history, they would have spent quite a bit of time to measure each other's out, maybe. And then there would have been only one or two little blows exchanged, kind of like some kind of samurai thing or something psychological. That would be nice.
I think that's a great idea. It puts me in mind of games like Fallout and Deus Ex, where they tried to always make alternate paths through the game where you just talked rather than fighting. And clearly both those had their issues. I think Fallout did it slightly better than the modern Deus Ex, to be honest, because the Deus Ex Human Revolution, if I recall, it had the system where you were meant to be able to kind of read, in air quotes, what the NPC was thinking and what they wanted to hear, and then you could kind of respond in certain ways so that it would push them down a certain conversation tree. But maybe I'm just completely inept, but I could never make sense of it, and I just thought, so I said this, and I thought it would calm them down, but now they're trying to gouge my eyes out. Okay, clearly that wasn't quite what I wanted to happen, and that just happened every time, basically. But I think some kind of verbal sparring, or some kind of, some really robust and some really fair system that the player can learn, which doesn't just turn into this kind of arbitrary, well, I think that's what they want to hear, but maybe it's not. Something like that, I think, could be extremely good, definitely.
I can't help but think of Monkey Island sword fighting
Of course,
the phrases, which does actually include some rather clever having adapt. When you fight the master, you need to use the responses that you've learned, but piecing together what responses work well with the completely unexpected barbs that she's throwing at you. But something clever like that would be good.
Yeah, and then in terms of other simulation-y things, I mean, clearly I'm doing the thing that I think should be done. I think games should sim culture more, so I'm doing that. But outside that, I'm not really sure. I mean, when you look at the 3 games we have here, when you look at other kind of sim-heavy games, whether it's Prison Architect or SimCity style games or even online style games and these sorts of things, I don't think that there's a huge amount in some ways which hasn't at least been attempted within a simulation, even if we can say, well, we think the combat should go down this route, or we think conversations should go down this route and so forth. I don't think that there's a huge amount out there which no one's yet tried to simulate. Though with that said, I think within single-player games, I don't think that there are many very robust economic systems simulated in single-player games. In things like Eve, again, clearly, there is no kind of top-down management of how cash in that game works, and it works out great as a result. But in purely single-player games, I can't think of any offhand which really feels if they truly have a kind of linked global economic system, which is maybe because they know the players would just try to break it by taking all the gold or giving all the gold to someone else and then seeing everyone starve. Maybe.
Well, some of those online games actually have employed economists to advise them on how to set up their economies, because it ends up very tricky, and some of them have done it wrong and they end up with severe problems because of that. But yeah, I've not seen There's a lot of single-player games with economies, but it's hard to prevent the kind of just endless grind.
Yeah.
One thing I'd like to see is more environmental effects. I'm thinking like the lava in Dwarf Fortress or the clouds of gas you get in Rogue, which I think make for really fun, engaging elements of gameplay. And seeing what more people can do with interesting environments. Maybe environments that aren't necessarily real. Like we're talking fantasy games and such here. We can have different weird environments that do things, but in it with some sort of underlying simulation, so that it's something the player can engage with in an intuitive way. And something else I'd like to see, simulation is maybe the wrong word, but magic systems. Complex, intricate magic systems that have, again, some sort of underlying rule set. So it's a simulation of something from a basic level, which producing these macroscopic effects. And you can interact with them and use them in a variety of really clever ways. Most roguelikes simply come down to you cast Firebolt in a certain direction and you get a line of fire in that direction. Doing much more on that, on like having areas of power that you have to draw from and different effects based on location and all sorts of things. Having a whole load of simulationist criteria going into that the player has to consider to make for a much more engaging magic system.
That sounds fairly close to what you're planning for the Dwarf Fortress magic system, right, Tarn?
Yeah, I mean that's the problem is that in order to do that, you have to make the game first, right? So you have to have grist for the mill, right? And we felt like we finally got there, so we're going to do it. That's the next thing. Procedurally generated magic systems, and we'll see what happens, right? It's like you can only do so much at first, and it's going to be a disaster, but it should be a disaster of the best kind. And we'll see how broken the game gets. But yeah, coming up with underlying rule sets that operate in, a variety of ways, just the sorts of things you'd think of. And yeah, that should be great fun, right? It doesn't even have to be balanced as long as the world generation knows how to react more or less to the rule sets. Then the world ends up a certain way. I mean, kind of almost by definition, the fantasy world is a world that's been unbalanced by magic, right? Or else it's not like a fantasy world. So it should be something we should be able to thrive on the imperfections of our system to a certain extent. And just kind of watch out for the most sort of unfun rule sets. The ones that just break the game utterly, like anyone can kill anyone else with a thought. I mean, probably breaks down pretty fast.
Well, I guess it would vary based on how smart the people in your world are.
Yeah.
Just imagining you'd have to constantly try and keep yourself distracted to not accidentally kill people with the wrong thought. So you mentioned unfun there, Tarn. One of the things that can come out of simulation is when you get something that simulationistly, in the simulation is correct, but is not particularly fun. And in particular, I'm thinking grinding. And I guess, what are your guys' attitudes towards this, where like the clearly obvious, sensible thing within the simulation is to do something really repetitive and unfun?
Well, for me, it was chopping down trees. Just happened this example. I don't know. Sami probably has a better idea, but it takes an hour to chop down a good sized tree with a stone axe. I don't know. It takes a while, and you don't want to have to manually click, cack, 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 cack. So we went to the travel screen, had the little hour bar move, and then the tree comes to be chopped down, and you get to watch it fall because that's a fun part, right? But you do lose, something, I guess, by not having to watch the process. But it's kind of a clear example of where something needs to be done because it's not a fun process. I mean, even if you made tree chopping down game and you made it, it's fun to angle correctly so that you're chopping out wedges or whatever you do in real life. I have no idea. It still probably gets boring after a while, even if you're doing it in VR and you're swinging your arms and stuff. It's still, I don't know how to make that a fun game forever. So you have to constantly be thinking whenever you make any mechanic for any game, whether it's a simulation or not. It's like, what is the player doing? What is this experience actually like? We're all making games at least somewhat for our players. I mean, we're obviously all in it for ourselves, pretty heavily. The three of us when we're doing these simulations. But at the same time, you do think about the player, and it's crucial. That's a crucial part of this.
Grinding's an intriguing one, as I think for simulation games, I think it varies a lot between a multiplayer simulation game and a single player one. And the multiplayer, again, to go back to the Eve example, the most kind of basic level economic acts that you can do in Eve are basically mining and finding salvage, and those are pretty dull and very, very repetitive in most cases. And whilst they can sometimes be spiced up, say if you go into a hostile system to try and find more expensive salvage, then you aren't just seeking out salvage, you're also playing this kind of extra game of trying to avoid the patrolling ships of the corp that controls that system, say. Or if you're mining, there's still a kind of risk-reward thing of, in the riskier systems are the better asteroids to mine, and so forth. But in the case of a game like that, I think, firstly, I'm not sure how you can ever avoid the kind of low-level economic grinding activity in a multiplayer simulation-heavy game, because there will always be people who are willing to, and in some cases even enjoy, just playing it extremely safe, and in Eve we call them Care Bears, of just playing it extremely safe and never going out to fight, never leaving your home system, and just parking your ship in front of a thing for 10 minutes and mining it. And although I think one is somewhat missing out on the true depth of that game if one does that, I think in a multiplayer game with so many different options for victory and for advancement, I think allowing for grinding, particularly when you can never grind your way up to the highest ranks, you can only grind your way, or rather within a single human lifespan, you could only ever grind your way up to a certain point. Whereas in a single player game, I'm inclined to think that, I think your example about the tree town is very apposite, in that you do want to specifically cater to the one exact experience of the specific person who is playing your game at that moment, and most people will not want to click the chop tree button 1,000 times, but some people will, and good for them, though I think they are probably quite peculiar. But you probably I don't think you need as much support, because you don't have to support a kind of full global system which has to work for everyone, because it only has to work for the single player. I think in most cases you can not cheat the system, but at least design the system in such a way that certain grindy activities are minimized or kind of obfuscated or pushed to one side or skipped in part. And I don't think the game loses something from that, because the simulation is not necessarily in making sure that things truly take 1 hour to chop down. It's in what are the many, many effects that chopping down this tree / what I do with the wood / who own the tree, etc. will have on my game world.
Interestingly, Unreal World is full of tree chopping business, and it's overloaded with wood chopping business, and it takes time also. So there are lots of things that can be considered grinding or boring everyday chores, but people don't complain about that too much. It's interesting, because in any other game, I think those tasks would soon be labeled as boring, or to be removed, or to be handled in some other way. But I think the setting saves us. They accept that the everyday tasks in Unreal World game world, they are pretty boring and they take time, and it's also quite essential to the game for some reason. It sounds crazy and I can't explain it, and I can't speak on behalf of the players why they enjoy it so much, but I just kept listening to you guys and thinking that some game has lots of wood chopping business and lots of other monotonous tasks also. But people often play it in a way that they spend a week in game time to do the basic tasks, fell down trees and chop firewood and build a cabin or kota or shelter, and then they have free time for next 2 weeks. So we take realism so far that we make the everyday tasks boring.
To be honest, in a way, in Unreal World, I think it does make sense that people enjoy that, because the game is concerned with the kind of absolute pragmatics and practicalities of not dying. I think sort of engaging on a very close level with how long does it take to chop this or make this fire or hunt this food and so forth. I think it's that kind of very sort of gnarly realism that people are going for, whereas clearly in Dwarf Fortress, say, the intriguing part of that sim is not in chopping trees, and therefore it's fine to just say, okay, well, we can watch it fall over and then we can just move on.
That must be it. Yeah.
One other question I have for all three of you is, your games are all surely at the scale that they're just impossible to test thoroughly before release. And you've hit on that before. I think Tarn, particularly, you're talking about how you end up with just mounting bugs upon bugs, and it's even harder to approach them with a long time before release. So how do you approach the release set? Do you have like small private testing groups or anything like that? Do you have any automated tools for testing? Or do you just release into the wild and hope for the best?
We did do a kind of closed, beta is such a weird word to use for this. It was a closed group of testers for a pre-alpha or whatever you'd call it, right? It was, I don't know what word, but we had about 10 people. And then when I just didn't have time to fix the bugs they came up with before I felt like I had to do a wider release, it just kind of redounded a little bit negatively back on them and so forth. So I don't do it anymore. I don't want people to take any blame for what's our problem, right? So it's like it was. I mean, yeah, it's. I'm sure people could manage it better than we did. We're not very good at managing anything, but we just release now. But at the same time, I do make sure, probably more carefully than I did 10 years ago, to test everything that I add. You make sure that you're not just, flat out wrong about something. So, any code you add should be tested, right? The other thing, I have a release protocol I go through. It's about 250 steps. Just check. I guess it's like a really bad version of unit testing. where just make sure, does trade still work? Do migrant waves still come? Schedule a few invasions. Do they work? Load up, several old saves. Do these things to them? Does that still work? Because we tend to break things pretty badly across the line randomly, and so I just like testing the major systems. And that will occasionally catch things for me. And then there's everything that doesn't get caught, and we just do bug reports after that.
Okay. I've always had a little group of trusted players or hardcore players, and the people change from version to version. There are some guys and girls who have been around for a decade or so, but it's this bunch of people is something that I call up. I email the players or put out a notification that if you want to get into playtesting, then email me. And it's always been like a group of dozen people at the max. And I've always trusted that if these guys will spot some nasty bugs, then there are some nasty bugs. And if they don't, then we are pretty much good to go. But, and I also have a not as long list as Tarn has, but a list of things to check my own before release. But basically it's just cold sweat, push the button and Godspeed, and then fix things quickly if something comes up.
I used to have two kind of playtesters who I know in real life, but one of them has vanished and the other one's not really a roguelike player. So what I'm doing for this release for the first time is I'm doing a kind of brief interim release where I've recruited about 30 people to do a closed playtest, which is probably the first, well, it is the first and most likely the only time I will do this, but just because I'm going from a world with no other creatures to a world with thousands and thousands of creatures being tracked across parts of a map grid that could be spawned or not spawned or partly spawned and saved, or it could be spawned but have buildings on them which aren't spawned, and all kinds of sort of different possibilities. So all that has really made me feel, well, I can test out every variation I can think of, but I just need to get more people playing it and more people just going around the world and trying to meet the NPCs within the world and just seeing if they work how they should. But I think that your point, Tarn, about a kind of checklist that you go through, I do that also, in that a few days before I release, I will just try to do all kinds of things. I will just pick a random town and go into the church and just check that the person who should be there is there, or I will pick a random mint and check that the money's there, or I will pick a random nation and check everyone there is wearing clothes, and all these sorts of things, and just do things that I think should work generally. And so long as they do, then I pretty much count that as, okay, it's time to just put it out and just hope that there's not too much out there that breaks people's games.
A very final point, for those that don't know, Sami's Unreal World recently was released on Steam. You should head there and buy it, or go directly to his website and buy it. And also, Tarn Adams recently did a joint talk with Tanya Short at GDC on practices in procedural generation. It's a great talk, check it out.
I recently did nothing of any of this sort, but I do have a book chapter on PCG coming out, so that's the best I can muster in that direction.
And we'll include links to those below.
Marvellous. So thank you all for joining me for this rather good episode. So thank you for tuning in, and if you enjoyed this, and if you listen on iTunes, then do please go and leave us a review. So thank you all, and good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Nighty night.
The show has collapsed. Would you like your podcasts identified?
We're trying our very best.